Hi, everyone. Today we're joined by Art Levine. Art Levine, I'm just going to read his Amazon profile, but he can correct anything if I get it wrong. Art Levine is a prize-winning contributing editor of the Washington Monthly and a Nation Institute Investigative Fund grantee. He's written for the American Prospect, Salon, The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, Mother Jones, Truth Out, Alternet, and numerous other publications. Among other awards, he was honored as Journalist of the Year by the Florida chapter of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill in 2001 for his articles in City Link, a Florida weekly exploring the criminalization of the mentally ill in South Florida. He's the author of Mental Health Inc., How Corruption, Lax Oversight, and Failed Reforms Endanger Our Most Vulnerable Citizens. And I'm also going to link two of his articles in the Washington Spectator titled Spaceship of Fools and UFO Tales and Witness Credibility Falling Apart After Congressional Hearings. Welcome, Art.
Thank you.
Did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's I basically, most of my reporting over the years has not been on UFOs and the paranormal, but I've periodically had an interest in it. And in the 90s, around the time of the 50th anniversary of Roswell, I did some writing about skeptical look at Roswell, and also helped put together, and this is the old days, MSNBC actually had a full day, nearly a full day devoted to Roswell, and I helped make some suggestion of guests, and I also included the work of Cal Korff, who had done an excellent it's skeptical investigative book at Roswell that still holds up pretty well, and he has a new one coming out in a few months.
Yep. So we'll talk about some of that and some related topics as well. Maybe we can also get into the mental health connection, if you think there is. But so how did you sort of get interested in the UFO / UAP landscape?
Well, I've always had an interest. Here's the thing is, I've always had an interest in odd subcultures. And I've also been sort of interested in cults and subcultures in general. So when I was a reporter in Florida, while covering more mainstream investigative work, I also covered subcultures like the Raelians, and there was also a Hispanic UFO cult, and I covered for Miami New Times a big event at a park where people were waiting for a UFO to arrive, and I covered that. So subcultures has long interested me, and I've read a lot. I haven't done that much writing on it, except recently when I became fascinated and about some of the newer developments that were going on regarding it, regarding UFOs and the claims that had been made about them. And then I learned through an investigative journalist, author, and skeptic, and also had been a consultant to intelligence agencies, that Cal Korff was acting as a whistleblower, filing complaints against To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, led by Tom DeLonge, and also featuring UFO influentials such as Christopher Mellon and Lou Elizondo. And I learned about that a while ago, and then I eventually was able to publish, an article in July of this past year, looking at it, kind of trying to pull everything together, because I was in particular, so knowing what I had learned and then seeing the generally credulous mainstream coverage, that was particularly alarming to me, and that's what I was writing about. But I also emphasized in that article something that had been underplayed in even the skeptics coverage, which is the cult-like mentality that was growing around UFO beliefs, and that this posed dangers and was sort of feeding the general evidence-free conspiracy thinking that has been criticized, by people monitoring things like QAnon or Kurt Anderson's book like Fantasyland, that this kind of evidence-free and not anti-science type of thinking was kind of destabilizing the American polity and helping lead to polarization. Now, QAnon isn't as extreme. I'm sorry, UFO belief isn't as extreme as QAnon, but it has some common ground where rumors can be built up into believed fact. And a central lesson that I took away from that is still not being applied to me is a central element of being in a cult-like mentality or group or a conspiracy theory is that your beliefs can't be falsified. That no matter what evidence comes forward, there's always some excuse. And, which sort of brings us in part to where we are where no matter what evidence or counterfactual information, there's always some explanation. And ultimately, the fallback is you too are part of the conspiracy, or you too are part of the deep state. So on some Twitter spaces, apparently, I've been accused by some members of what has been labeled the UFO hate group of being like a CIA asset,
Yeah.
And, no, I don't get funding from the government to do skeptical, science-oriented reporting.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think you're alluding to the worldview backfire effect, which is when people hunker down in their beliefs when they're challenged. They assume that the other person is in on the conspiracy or is
right. And it varies. And I've read a lot, and I recommend reading these like Mike Rothschild's books on QAnon and his more recent books on Jewish space lasers. There's sort of this intermingling of UFO with other worlds. But what was striking to me, and a point I emphasized in the first article, was this conspiracy belief or pandering to the conspiracy belief. Because the mainstream and even people like Chris Mellon always have these little outs where they go, well, it's probably this, or could be, or they give it the patina of credibility without definitely screaming from the rooftops, it's alien. But that is the impression you're supposed to have. That's the impression that CBS and 60 Minutes gave, the New York Times, and most of the mainstream coverage, the Washington Post, when it's treating respectfully Lou Elizondo. And the problem is that I see this is the first major conspiracy thinking that is embraced by both the left and the right, along with inside left, right, and the mainstream major outlets for liberal and conservative. So anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories absolutely draw from people from the Marin County New Age movement and the Trumpist right-wing movement. And the anti-vax movement became a central feeder into the QAnon movement, okay? So there was a lot, and people like Dave Troy cover it. And there's the podcast Conspirituality that looks at these issues. So the what's different that sets UFO conspiracy thinking is you have Fox News and the New York Times, with rare exceptions, like maybe one article in 3 years that's mildly skeptical from the Times, an occasional op-ed. But on what other issue does Fox News and the New York Times generally go all in and have the same perspective? I can't think of one. The only difference between Fox News and the New York Times is Fox News more explicitly links the alleged cover-up of the UFO truth of aliens and dead bodies and crash retrieval to their broader narrative that you can't trust the government and the deep state is after you. So the New York Times isn't as explicit. Tucker Carlson's, his first big, he had before he was fired or pushed out, however you want to turn, his first big independent project was a big UFO thing. And if you go to the Fox News and just look at all of the different coverage they give it, it's always designed with the takeaway, either explicit or implicit, the government is lying to you, just like they lied to you about that Trump lost, So, but there's no defamation law. See, that's one of the key issues. There's no defamation lawsuit for lying through your teeth about UFOs or shading the evidence. If they're, and that's where there's I think going to be some important developments over the next few months. It started, I think, with the whistleblower complaints of Korf to the Council of Inspector Generals and to the SEC. There has not yet been a definitive response, but I was able to determine through my independent reporting, not from Korf's say-so, that the SEC was taking it seriously. But it takes a while for these things to develop. So anyway, so there's so many elements going on, and now we have all these news in the last 2 weeks about the changes in Arrow and new questions on Grush. So the field's still wide open.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the sort of the talking out of both sides of your mouth aspect that some of these people do. Like they intimate that it could be something that they don't know, but they're not sure, but like they really mean it's aliens. But I think David Grush has alluded to the interdimensional hypothesis as his favorite one. Do you see that sort of thing as, in a way, a return to the 1970s when Jacques Vallée and Hynek were kind of further developing the interdimensional hypothesis for UFOs? And there was also some religious fundamentalists, incidentally, who were pushing the demonic angle as well.
Right.
In a way, we're reverting to that?
Well, yeah. See, that actually what happens is, what I think I've noticed is, so Vallée has always held that view. And clearly, what's happened over the last few years, I think, is first the Times and then even the all let it all hang out skinwalkers at the Pentagon book by Lukotsky, Knapp, and Colm Kelleher. And I interviewed both Kelleher and and Knapp and stuff, and got to know the issues from their point of view. And Kelleher was very helpful in terms of giving his point of view. But what's happened is the window started with UFOs are real and aliens, and then when that got accepted, then some very influential people in this field, their interdimensional thing then began to filter. And so you've noticed in the last year or two, people who were not directly explicitly invoking the possibility of interdimensional were getting much more explicit about it. I think it could be even Chris Mellon sort of hints at it. Elizondo has gotten more open about that point of view. And by the way, interdimensional, why don't you give your explanation for your listeners how they understand interdimensional rather than just use the jargon term? What's your take on what they mean by interdimensional?
Well, I think Vallée means another spatial dimension that we can't perceive. They're coming from that dimension. So they're basically right next to us, but we can't perceive them except when they come into our realm, for lack of a better word. Or it could also mean like another universe. It's sort of part of the multiple universe hypothesis.
Right. So in other words, this is like across the Spider-Verse brought into the world of UFOs.
Yeah.
There's that Marvel movie about alternative universes and stuff. So yeah, and one of the things that it does is, Vallée is so interesting because he he is kind of the founding thinker in this arena, but he also points to, things that turned out to be total hoaxes, like Trinity, that in theory involve evidence, like a piece of metal that supposedly from the 1945 crash right at the Trinity bomb site, in which little tiny aliens crawled out, and people in their 70s and 60s recollected what they saw, and then they've all been discredited by these fabulous reporting by D. Dean Johnson. But he is placed in both camps. It seems to me the interdimensional hypothesis, one, it adds more fuel to the religious belief side of things. It adds explicitly the notion of alternative and supernatural realities, and it also kind of decreases the need to actually have scientific evidence, I think. In other words, if you're pushing the notion that, well, they appear from other dimensions, well, then you don't have to you meet the Carl Sagan standard of extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, because how can you provide extraordinary proof of an actual dead alien pilot or an actual metal not of this world if it's just interdimensional coming in occasionally? However, I don't know how the interdimensional, I guess a guy like Vallée, who went all in on Trinity and doubled down and tripled down on it in the wake of the expose of the hoax. And for your readers, go to D. Dean Johnson and look at his articles and his Twitter thread about it, and it's in his pinned tweet. It is one of the most spectacular hoaxes since the Piltdown Man from the 19th century. I mean, it's just remarkable. These two guys who are the primary witnesses were fabricating almost all their entire careers. The policeman, who was a family friend, wasn't even working as a policeman at the time. And it's just and they had been changing their stories for the last 20 years, and they've been pitching it and trying to get money for it, and then adjusting their stories. And then a third guy comes in. You might know his name. Jeff Knox is always on this guy. He's the fabricator who claims to be the son of an Air Force pilot. And he's always there. He's like the Zelig of hoaxes. He shows up with, whatever you're interested in, I know the real story, and my father was there, and here's what I learned from him. And so he's there. He's bringing in Mussolini. He's part of the Mussolini hoax. He's part of Trinity. He's like the traveling salesman of hoaxing.
Yeah, you're referring to a William Brophy Jr.
Yes, that's the guy. That guy's amazing.
Mm-hmm. But
go ahead.
I was going to mention again about Vallée, who he sort of invokes a trickster aspect to the interdimensional beings. He says that they're coming here to kind of present themselves in the image of the age. So now it would be aliens.
Oh, okay.
Push along societal evolution in a certain direction. But Grush is saying, or he's also crediting the interdimensional hypothesis. He's actually alluded to aliens and the government killing people.
Right. No, you're talking now about Grush.
Yeah,
when
Grush.
You say killing people, the killing people.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But do you think that sort of thing is, and Jensine Anderson in her book Hyperconvergence, a recent book about UFOs, she says that sort of demonology and that kind of threat narrative could create a very dangerous situation in a country where there's so many people with guns and so much religious fanaticism. Do you agree with that?
I think the potential is there. It really is there, particularly since we are in a completely post-truth environment. You've got to remember, in other areas. So let's say Trump, when he's unless he dies, he's going to be the nominee. Okay, that's my view. He's 100% going to be the nominee. He's now openly using literal Nazi rhetoric about vermin. Why I'm mentioning it is, if he sees a little edge to get, RFK Jr. like, and being a little more open about UFOs, he could see that could help push him over, that, it could help his chances in certain swing states where he could draw in, different demographics who believe it. If you now have a majority of the public, in a way they have not done so earlier in the wake of the New York Times, now believing that the questions are like, do you think the military sightings of UFOs are likely the result of aliens? So the question itself is like, these 100% accurate pilots, and we should trust them, and they have seen UFOs. And the answer is now a majority of the public think that. So that means tens of millions of people, and the whether it's the more polite version of the cover-up from the Times to the more right-wing deep state pushing of Fox, you have a significant portion of the public is believing in the cover-up. And that can be weaponized, definitely can be weaponized. And you obviously have UFO influencers, their podcast is called Weaponized. So Corbell and Knapp. And that's one of the things, this sort of violent rhetoric that, I reported on in both articles, that leads to the kind of harassment and smears against people who are at all raising any critical questions. There's a very interesting, I get at is we are seeing, and the other point to understand this, which is something, I don't know if I use the term directly in my articles, but the notion of stochastic terrorism really has to be kept in mind. It only takes one unhinged person with an assault weapon or a good rifle or something to go kill some perceived enemy of, the truth about UFOs. Just one person. And in my first article, I quote this guy who goes by the name Manny, who did the Area 503, where he got a lot of threatening things, and his girlfriend was doxxed. And he actually came out in the article using his real name. You can look it up. But he said, how long before a follower of Lou Elizondo shoots someone? You see, that if the rhetoric is nonstop and there's no countervailing narrative, even from the mainstream, and when you fall down the rabbit hole, the problem with getting in the rabbit hole, which is tens of millions of people, is any counter narrative is seen as part of the cover-up. That's part of the non-falsifiability of their beliefs. And I always make the point, they go, there's like this guy who's, I think, offers very good but pro-UFO news alerts, Mike Colangelo. I think I find his Twitter, he's always posting latest news. It's very pro-UFO believer, but it's very useful. And, he's bringing forward this information, which just illustrates just how common these belief systems are, and everything is just adding to the narrative. And at some point, there's going to be a tipping point. Now, here's the parallel, but it hasn't reached this level yet, is the Great Replacement theory pushed on social media and by Tucker Carlson. New York Times counted up, and this was, like 2 years ago, he had 400 segments referencing the Great Replacement theory of implicit or explicit globalists, i.e. Jews, manipulating immigrants to come to America and take away our jobs and flood our voting and take away our rights and rape our wives and daughters. This was endlessly repeated. And then when the New Zealand killings happened, and then the killings at Tree of Life and the Black Church in the Carolinas and the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, all of that is because they were fed a belief system. Now, the thing is, we don't have at this moment nonstop, but we're getting there. In other words, News Nation, in other words, if you're a follower of News Nation and you listen and believe everything Ross Coulthard says about all of it implying, and he explicitly goes around and periodically accuses Senator Gillibrand, who had been more sympathetic to it, and certainly Sean Kirkpatrick of being part of the cover-up. But he's always doing it and asking questions. Same way Tucker Carlson and Fox News. We're just asking questions. So if you are a consumer of conspiracy thinking, deep state cover-up, and you're mentally unhinged, and you're consuming it endlessly, you may go berserk. And I talked about in the first article, there have been a few examples where people were so in the rabbit hole and mentally unstable, they killed family members.
Yes.
I know that's certainly scary. So that's that we're not at that point now, but that's the whole point. It only takes one unhinged person to be inspired and fueled by violence rhetoric to do something awful.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think this can be studied? And you come from an epidemiological background, but do you think that this these spread of these kinds of beliefs can be modeled explicitly as a pathogen? Or do you think that's necessarily a helpful analogy?
Well, I'm not actually, I have studied epidemiology and medical research. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a medical investigative journalist, largely. I think the notion of social contagion is a useful one, but it doesn't track. I don't know enough about it, but I have some suggested reading. But I think this notion of a social contagion has been documented in other arenas. So, for instance, the impact of diet crazed teenagers and their influencers on TikTok have definitely had an impact on affecting teenage girls' feelings, about their weight. So that you have a social contagion element that might be contributing to things like anorexia and bulimia. I'm just using that as there's some evidence that ideas. So I think it's a very loose analogy, but I don't think it can be used in the concrete way like you could with COVID as an airborne illness, that infects people, which also isn't being addressed properly.
Yeah, of course.
What is your view about how to think about the conspiracy thinking and your view about what could be done about it? And then I'll try to give my views.
Well, I think you can take multiple approaches. One is to think of you've heard of memes, right? Of course.
Yes.
That's been treated as a kind of, the analogy that Richard Dawkins and others have drawn is to treat them as kind of the analogy, like the equivalent of genes. They spread and mutate. I mean, that's got some limitations, but I think that's partially helpful. So you can look at that perspective. The other way is to think about evolutionary psychology and certain predispositions in the human psyche, which may cause us to believe in irrational things or mistake phenomena for UFOs. That's another aspect. But then there's also just the science education, I think, is the key, is helping the lay person understand the basics, at least, of science.
Right.
So that the disinformation is short-circuited right there. So that they don't get into the rabbit hole. They can sort of assess the basics right from the start, and then they don't have to go on that detour, which can lead them, to a bad place.
Well, you by the way, you're an instructor in evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology?
No, just basic biology and environmental science. But my background is in evolutionary biology.
Right. So I thought a lot about it. I read Red Pill, Blue Pill. I've read a number of books on conspiracy thinking, and then they interview experts and they talk about how hard it is. And on a mass level, in other words, to get people out of rabbit holes is really difficult. It's basically one-on-one relationships. They give different advice, don't walk. So I read it and it's kind of disappointing if you see tens of millions of people radicalized into conspiracy thinking. How are you going to do something about it? You see? And so the term that is used somewhat, but not widely, actually taught is digital literacy and digital critical thinking skills. So I do think in the long run, if you had the notion, and there's this excellent Carl Sagan article that hopefully you'll end up posting, where it's an overview of his debunking toolkit for skeptics, and there's like 10 excellent things about you can't argue from authority. Why I'm mentioning it is teaching people the elements of thinking critically as opposed to leaping to conclusions based on a social media post, I think is something that if it was part of civic education in our schools, maybe in 20 years could make a difference. But I don't see in the short run, that's why it's so disappointing. I don't see anything in the short run that is going to help people get out of the rabbit hole that they're in, unless they somehow come to it themselves. And there's a really excellent podcast by the New York Times. I think it's called The Rabbit Hole, where, spoiler alert, the guy ends up getting out of the rabbit hole, but they track how this guy who was kind of a lonely single guy who just broke up with his girlfriend and started watching Jordan Peterson videos, and then, with their elements of misogyny and transphobia and stuff, and then the algorithm just fed more and more extreme stuff. So then he was all in on the most extreme stuff. But then he noticed some contradictions and things like some predictions didn't come through. So he on his own began to have doubts. And then on his own decided to look up skeptical commentary, which he ignored for 3 years. But what was brilliant about it is he was astute enough technically that the New York Times and the reporters and the broadcasters had total access to his entire web history and social media history for like 3 or 4 years. So they could tell you precisely the turning points. And it's pretty sure. And there's also an experiment, and I don't think the algorithms have really changed, particularly not now, certainly not in Twitter, where, hello, Nazis, come on board. And nobody wants the algorithms monkeyed with because engagement is too important for their profit margin, and it's fueled. And so there's these excellent experiments that were revealed by the Facebook whistleblower, where they created a fake account of a woman like 50 years old who just liked Trump. And they had the count, I think it was even automatized, this is in-house, to like anything that they came into her feed. And within 3 days, she was in Nazi Facebook groups. That's how fast this can happen. So getting people out of that stuff is hard, but hopefully it can be done. I do notice, and that's where work like you and the people who do get attention, I think are doing it. Stephen Greenstreet and Stephen Cambion's work, your work, Mick West, John Greenwald, who's a centrist, is also valuable because he is such a guy who clearly would like to believe, but he's also very factually and detail oriented. And so he gets a lot of crap where the hate groups actually refer to him as, vermin who should be exterminated. I mean, it's just unbelievable that just trying to stick to a certain modicum of rationality and studying details and then, I'm a big fan of Jason Colavito, who's, made his mark first with, lengthy ongoing critiques and in books of a lot of the ancient alien theories, but is also witty and on top of the latest nonsense being peddled. And unfortunately, with the sign of the rabbit hole right now, incredibly firm grip, is the David Grush controversy. In my book, is that, he can't, well, what is your take about the latest developments on Grush and Sean Kirkpatrick, for instance, in Politico and on his Facebook, on his LinkedIn page, saying, hey, he hasn't come to us. And the defenders of Grush say, well, you're lying. He has absolutely came to you. There's all this lying, excuses, and so on. What is your take on the Grush and the Grush versus Sean Kirkpatrick disputes?
Well, I guess initially I just assumed that Grush was completely sincere, even if misinformed. But his refusal to talk to Arrow is kind of suspect, I think, and to say the least. And I think that with all this UAP legislation that they're trying to push through, some of the wording is very problematic. It would expand the number of Congress people who are privy to special access programs. That's going to create a counterintelligence problem.
Right.
These are issues that Jensine Anderson brought up in her book, by the way.
Yeah, can you, if you could, if possible, complete your thinking on Grush and then tell us about the book and why that's important, because this is not widely known, and you sent me a sample of it. Jack Brewer did an interview with her. Give me your take, if you could, on Grush, and then move on to this book, because you're raising some very important points.
So Grush, as I mentioned, he's pushing the interdimensional hypothesis, and he's promoting a kind of demonology, if you want to put it that way, in which the aliens and the government are killing people to cover up the conspiracy. And so that's already unhelpful, because it's creating a threat narrative which trigger unhinged people, including also Stephen Greer, who the guy who pushes the CE5. He's coming out with all this nonsense that he's going to lead a commando team to, bust open the facilities and expose the alien technology. This creates like a very serious counterterrorism issue that, the FBI probably needs to get on top of that, because you never know what these people might do. So Grush is unfortunately kind of tied into that. But I think that he's, and I've talked about him before in an article in my blog. He
and give us the title again of your blog?
ufologyiscorrupt.com.
Oh yeah, great stuff. Stuff.
Thanks. So I wrote an article about Grush with the help of Jeff Knox, by the way. Everybody should check out Jeff's Twitter. But basically Grush is he doesn't claim that he saw any alien tech. He's just conveying other people's stories. Right. And so one of the stories he's pushing, he almost certainly got it from Elizondo, is the David Brophy Jr. story, which is like completely fake. It's a embellished version of a probably already fake story. And this already draws questions about Grush.
Mussolini, 1930.
Yes, exactly. And incidentally, that's also got a Nazi tie-in, because it talks about Aryan Nordic aliens. And it also, some treatments of that story tie it to the Glocker, the bell. The bell shape. Can we freeze frame for one moment? Is the bell shape the claim Nazis reverse engineered it, or the Nazis had it? What is the bell-shaped Nazi UFO premise? There's different premises, but one of them is that the Nazis were using a kind of a mystical energy called vril,
Oh, right.
which is actually from a story from Edward Bulwer Lytton, who was a science fiction author in the 19th century about a
Right.
race of underground super beings.
Oh, yeah, which has a long history to the
Yeah.
Shaver mystery,
Mhm.
to Richard Doty Benowitz, and today with our trans mediums. It's a long history.
Yeah. The underground theme or trope has been, it's got a long pedigree. Um, but the Glocker, the bell, that's been variously tied to, Nazi programs to make like exploit some sort of dark energy. And many
Right,
white supremacists actually believe this stuff literally. They believe that there's
right.
a
And there's that excellent book, The Black
The
Sun,
Black Sun
where
by Nicholas Goodrick Clark. Mhm.
yeah, where he goes over how not just the history, but how modern day white supremacists have embraced these occult theories,
Yes.
and and yeah, what basically it really is true, kind of if you peel back the onions of almost any conspiracy theories, somewhere you're going to find anti-Semitism and white supremacy,
Yeah.
almost always, sort of
Mhm.
at the root. Even the people who right now, I would say almost everybody in UFO Twitter is a true believer, doesn't see themselves as white supremacists and aren't anti-Semites, but the feeding wells of the conspiracy theories have these
Mhm.
origins of aliens who were noble Aryans trying to help us, and Jews. There's always Jews in the bottom of every conspiracy
Yeah.
theory.
And also the theories of David Icke and his
Oh
reptilian.
yeah, the lizard people is so anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
And that was one of the murders that I described. This person who was fed by both, he was a devout Christian, highly seemingly mentally healthy owner of a surf shop in California, who began imbibing David Icke's theories and QAnon, and came to believe that his children had inherited his wife's lizard people DNA, so they had to be killed.
Yeah.
Okay, there wasn't a long history of this guy being hospitalized in a mental health institute. That's what makes it especially scary. This is a guy who ran a business, was an athlete, a regular churchgoer, and had two kids and what seemed to be a happy family life. That somehow he got radicalized. I don't. That's the thing, is I am, as someone who's really thought and written a lot about mental illness, I am unclear. I can understand how social media can interact with someone who's already paranoid, schizophrenic, or predisposed to it in some way that they may not have gotten treatment for, may not have been recognized. But what I'm unclear is how social media radicalizes people into insane beliefs at such levels where they're then willing to be violent. I mean, that's one of the striking things if you look at some of the analysis of who were the actual January 6 people that were climbing up walls and were there to kill Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence. They were mostly baby boomers, and most had zero criminal records. Most had jobs. Now, some, maybe a disproportionate amount, had high debts. But what I'm getting at is there's nothing in their, yes, they're conservatives and they like Trump, but there's nothing in their backgrounds, most of them, that would then turn them in to people who are chanting "Hang Mike Pence." That's what's particularly scary about the impact of social media. And like, one of my thoughts about this is, look how good a job Hitler did at radicalizing people with just radio and a lot of leaflets. I
Mhm.
mean, he was able to get an entire population involved and motivated, and at least knowing about, and tolerating the bigotry and the crystal knocked and then leading to the gas chambers. And that was with the communication. Do you imagine how bad it already was? Do you imagine if the full scope of social media and internet was alive and well like today in the 1930s? Holy mackerel. Well, that's the risk that we have right now. However, it's not yet happening. And so right now what I'm saying sounds like crazily alarmist. It's a bit like people who are warning about Trump as being, a fascist and authoritarian 2 to 3 years ago. It was viewed as, oh, it's Trump derangement syndrome. So at this, in the last few days, the media started to turn when Trump used his vermin language, and they began using actual in headlines, at least the Washington Post did, and they actually said the words Hitler and Mussolini would show up in headlines in mainstream media about Trump. It took him saying, I'm going to, and other news articles, I'm going to put millions of immigrants in camps, and I view my opponents as vermin. And then when the spokesperson is called for comment from spokesperson, he says, oh, well, they're just snowflakes, but they're all going to be extinguished when Trump becomes president. This is the answer to the charge that he's using dehumanizing language. Why I'm bringing up this radicalism and extremism, we are seeing on the front pages how once unthinkable ideas that were in the complete fringes made it into mainstream. At this point, we don't have that danger from UFOs, belief system or conspiracy thinking of the deep state, but the kernels and seeds are there that could grow. I mean, and already you have basically deep state conspiracy theorists like Jeremy Corbell regularly appearing on places with millions of viewers, at least hundreds of thousands, like Fox News. So, of course, I'm a liberal and I'm, tend to be worried about these issues, but I think the potential is very dangerous.
Yes.
Potential. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there could be with the crash retrieval stories, such as the ones conveyed by Grush, there could be a sort of eschatological or religious yearning for like a fallen angel or some story like that, or a secret technology that can save us?
Well, I think that's part of the belief, and Michael Shermer has done some very good essays in Scientific American and video. By the way, please define eschatological for your audience.
Doesn't it mean sort of the arch of history in the religious view?
So, okay, so here's the thing: is what is really interesting to me, and why it is. Yes, I think there's a religious yearning, but the really fascinating element is there's a religious yearning that undergirds a lot of the UFO belief. But Shermer actually has hard data from academic studies. And it does make sense to me where if you are less tied to conventional organized religion, less faithful, less of a believer, you're definitely going to be more interested in UFOs. And what the UFO world is a sort of cloaked in scientism and the seemingly rational evidence of higher beings. And that's why, to detour, and please get me back to the main point, but Stephen Greer has this big beef with what's odd is Greer's big beef with many of the other UFO promoters is, hey, they're actually benign. They're not a threat to us. And that he sort of says that all of the UFO talk about dangers in the skies coming both from official military and UFO promoters like Knapp, Elizondo, and Corbell. They're all promoting they're trying to make us get ready for a fake war against fake dangerous. He's actually saying there's going to be some kind of equivalent of fake alien landings as part of a military buildup. Maybe I'm over exaggerating what he's saying, but he says, "Oh, they're more benign," and the justification that helped build the mainstream interest, which was UFOs in our skies. We don't know what they are. They could be aliens, but they're definitely a threat, and then we don't know what they are. And it's the military threat narrative that was the gateway to getting it into platform mainstream, as opposed to, interdimensional beings or angels. So I do think, what I think is that the interdimensional being, which is already part of the UFO world, like with Mr. Bledsoe, who talks about meeting, an angelic being, and I forgot what Mary or different angelic beings are part of his, abduction and meeting narrative, which also has inspired some unhinged people to take dangerous actions. So it has been part of the narrative, and I think it's going to be increasingly part of the narrative. But I think most people who are true believers and are engaging on UFO Twitter and following people like UFO Joe or Post-Disclosure or Corbell and Knapp are generally hinging it to what they think is evidence that should be taken seriously. In other words, my view is that their perspective is, we've already seen, they look at government reports that show anomalies, and they look at all sorts of videos and photos, many of which are either mistaken or hoaxes, but not all of them. And they go, well, this is proof enough. In other words, where there's smoke, there's fire, I think is the underlying belief system. If we have so many accounts, so many people talking about abductions, that although that narrative has fallen off the radar with the total exposure of the nonsense of hypnotic regression, completely discredited. And I urge people to read Jack Brewer's The Grays Have Been Framed, but what I'm getting at is that while the animation of their belief has a religious quality, it is not explicitly what they're holding on to for most of them. That's what I think. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say because America has been such a religious country compared to other Western democracies.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe some of that kind of quasi-religious thinking has seeped into people who are not explicitly religious, but they're still hankering for something like a final answer or some sort of salvation.
I think that's absolutely true, which is, I remember actually hearing, on the Art Bell show, a guy who was an author arguing that there is something almost genetic about the search for meaning. I don't think there's a DNA that says search for meaning. It has icons of all the religions on it. But there is something deep in the human spirit that wants answers about why we're here and would welcome the notion that there are higher beings looking down on us, and I think that's, understandable. I think the difference, what is striking to me when I'm trying to, because I'm fascinated about conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking, and there's an excellent scholarly book that has a title like Some People Are Saying, and what it looks at is that how I think it applies to the UFO belief system is modern day QAnon is an example of pure conspiracism. And they're trying to distinguish in conspiracism and traditional conspiracy thinking. And now conspiracism means without a shred of evidence, millions can believe that Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks are part of a massive child trafficking ring and are drinking children's blood and ripping off the faces of children and putting them on their and getting the Anitochrome and putting their children's faces on their own. Okay, millions of people. 12% of the American public total believe in lizard people. That's a lot. Okay, that's pure conspiracism. Now, the most prominent conspiracy thinking, although people who believe in it say, well, it's not a conspiracy thinking, is the JFK assassination. Both the JFK assassination, and I am a person whose views changed in part from reading the works of Gerald Posner and Cal Korff to believe there actually was just a lone assassin. Okay, that's my own, but I used to believe in the mafia did it. But both JFK and the 9/11 truthers, where there were different variations, it was an inside job, the government deliberately did it, or the government knew about it and did nothing deliberately. Both sets of conspiracy thinking had some things to build on. That's what's really remarkable. In other words, looking back, you can almost be nostalgic about, well, there was the strange movement of the bullet. What happened to that bullet? You know, there was an argument based on what appeared to be rational evidence. You know, only 3 bullets in 6 seconds. How's that? You know, there's actually a 4th bullet. Or they would study and argue over when does girders melt. You see, you know, when do girders melt, and you know why it couldn't have been the plan. You know, but the point is they were arguing around what appeared to be real evidence. And what the UFO world is, it's a mix of both right now, where it's predominantly rooted in the world of JFK and the truthers, where there's definitely stuff going on. There's things in the air. There's things that crash. And so it makes sense that you would believe in these things and not be too critical. On the other hand, then it gets, then that the realistic items then can serve as fuel for the quasi-religious stuff that has no evidence, you know. And that sort of brings us into back to Grush, where he's told these stories about, the reverse engineered craft, and he believes them, and then, but he never came forward with the evidence. And then if you look, the reason I'm bringing it up is it appeared that he appeared to be coming forward a promise, and now we're what, 160 days, about 160 days into June 5th when he broke the story. He hasn't produced a shred of verifiable evidence, and there's all these excuses about why he hasn't. But even here's the thing is, if Grush had just gone public with whatever shards of evidence he had, it would have been enough. It would have been justifiable to believe, we as science don't have to accept it, but there'd at least be something to argue over. You see, something to debate. Like you have the critics of the Warren Report, and then you have people like Gerald Posner and Kyle Korff who show, through reconstructions about how it actually could be, one lone assassin. Or you have popular mechanics versus conspiracy theories on 9/11. You have specifics that people could debate over. Hopefully, actual scientists could study and then reach a conclusion. But right now, the Grush world is moving. It's basically on territory because there's no evidence except his say-so. And then what evidence that's why I find the whole thing around Grush so fascinating to me is because, and I reprinted it in my second article. I got a statement from Susan Goff that was very clear about absolutely anything related to aliens that he's discussed publicly. He is allowed to discuss every detail publicly, and she puts in writing, none of it is classified and none of it is sensitive. Zero. So that means the entire dance. So, well, I can't talk, at the hearing. Well, do you know where they're located? Yeah, but I can't talk about it now. We can talk about it in a skip. And then does he have the clearance to talk in a skip? Or do the congressman have there's all this dancing when he could go public at any point and not face a scintilla of penalty, particularly in the wake of the NDAA thing, where, even if you have an NDAA, please come forward. And a deadline was given. So, plus media attention. There's literally no way that he would go to jail for giving details or the men in black would kill him. Just wouldn't happen. And this is the UFO conspiracists basically hold on to these excuses or why there's no evidence, and that anything. So now to them, the latest sign that the cover-up is still alive and well is this guy, Sean Kirkpatrick, retiring from Arrow, claiming that Grush won't come forward. He says there's 5 people who've tried to do outreach, and he lists in the article in Politico the different excuses. We're not cleared. This could jeopardize his whistleblower protection. And why don't you just get it from the IG's office? And, these are the excuses that he's heard. So what is the response of Matt Ford and the UFO hustler community, huckster community is, oh, well, Kirkpatrick must be lying, So who's more like, so my view is, I happen to think that those calling for Kirkpatrick to come forward with some, redacted proof, an email where he redacts the email address, or who's the 5 people, where they show efforts or phone calls, where he's something to back it up. But what is remarkable to me is that here's this guy who's retiring, who is essentially, in the view of UFO believers, smearing a guy who testified under oath that, yeah, I spoke to him briefly quite a while ago, but I'm waiting to hear from him. He has my phone number under oath, says explicitly they're not interested in what I have. Although he acknowledges that some of his witnesses have gone to Arrow, and Arrow has said, we've interviewed many of the witnesses and we don't find them credible. But he made under oath a claim that the primary DOD is interested in precisely this information has no interest. Kirkpatrick says that's a total lie. And he first was generically critical of him, in his LinkedIn, but with his Politico thing, and he's leaving, he's rolling up his sleeves going, 5 people, he's giving us excuses. We'd like him to come forward. He refuses to do so. And I think it's reasonable that the general public, or these supposed, somebody like Gillibrand, with a week's notice, could get both of them in a private room to give affidavits and be questioned. Who's telling the truth? Arrow has zero interest and refuses to speak to Grush, or is Kirkpatrick, does he have any proof that he made efforts to reach Grush? And nobody's trying to get to the bottom of this, and they're all taking, biased sides about it. If Grush is telling the truth, It's the most important, secret in the history of the world. So you'd think there'd be a little interest on this very easily resolved dispute. I don't know. What is it? Just drives me crazy. My theory is the true believers are not pushing for real proof. They just want to disc Kirkpatrick because they want to keep the narrative going. But what is your take? It's just maddening to me.
Yeah, I concur with all that. Could you expand just a little bit on why you think that he wouldn't face any consequences if he were to go public with all his information if he had it? I'm talking about Grush.
Yeah, well, I think all right. One is the sheer weight of public and media opinion would protect him. More than that, here's why. It's really clear to me, and maybe this is where I would bring in, you don't have to have, you could have, you're not going to have a hearing on this issue, but you can bring him in and have affidavits and a stenographer. The DOD has been really clear and keeps getting clearer and clearer. Nothing he has said publicly, and he said a lot of bizarre stuff publicly, not a smidgen of it is sensitive or classified. And you have the UFO believers who don't really understand this stuff. And even Neil deGrasse Tyson believe, oh, well, there's some classified stuff, so how could I debate him? None of it is classified. They refuse to believe it. They refuse to take it face value. So if the DOD says nothing is classified or sensitive, I think, for instance, let's say he spoke to someone who is in some kind of crash retrieval program, he could redact the name of it and make it public or something. But he's made a wide series of wide-ranging claims, none of which, so if the Department of Defense says, nothing he has said or nothing related to UFOs or aliens is classified or sensitive. One. Two, the NDA legislation, I want you to expand on some of the risks on it. The NDA legislation and subsequent legislation is there's a deadline. Please come forward. Even if you had an NDA, it is not going to prevent you from telling us, members of Congress, or I don't know the details of it, but it's the concept. I don't know it's not going to prevent you from telling what you know about the programs. That's the point of the Schumer bills, in part because of that government panel, but the NDAA that was signed into law, I think earlier this year, that passed in 2022, that included, the historical search for going back to Trinity, all of that, and earlier it basically said, come forward, tell us what you know, you will be protected. They're so explicit in that law. So you have DOD, the law, public opinion, and media coverage. You think in a million years he comes forward and says, there's a UFO. It's located in Reno, Nevada, in this hangar. You think he's going to be shot or arrested for saying that? No. I just think it's totally impossible.
Right. So, but
I'm sorry to be so wound up about it, but I can't stand the obfuscation, sophistry, and evasiveness of the pro-UFO community. Is always coming up with some excuse. But then when you actually study people who write about conspiracy thinking, there's in fact a wonderful little video essay, I think either in Wired or Scientific American, how you can't win an argument with a conspiracy believer. It's impossible. So essentially, the narrative that's dominating the news and social media is led by UFO conspiracy thinkers. And so they on their own platforms, deep state cover up, government lying, the evidence is there, and it's the evil government that is preventing Grush from telling the truth. That's the narrative. It's just, and that I'm sorry, I know I'm going overboard on my passion, but it's such a major claim that's driven news coverage, created hearings, and could be the greatest secret, and yet nobody's trying to get to the bottom of. Barely doesn't want to tell anything. And here's the other point that I mentioned in my, I think it was in the first or the second article. There's clear-cut evidence, and it was first caught by Stephen Cambion when he went to the House Intelligence Committee in December and turned over his transcripts. The totally cleared high classification aides and members of, I think it may have just been aides who were in the room for him for several hours, came away with the view that he wasn't credible. That it means that the transcripts that he allegedly produced, according to, always trustworthy Leslie Keene and Ralph Blumenthal, you notice the irony there, that they found his personal testimony, and they felt that whatever transcripts of testimony of his interviews that he produced wasn't credible. So the word from those House staffers got back to Burchett, and he gives this remarkable claim that he's doubled down on at least twice, that mainstream media is totally ignored, which is he speculates that they could have been brainwashed or blackmailed by honeypots like the Soviet Union had. That, sexy, some of this language is my language, not his language, okay? It's my paraphrasing. But the notion was, if you look to the first comment, and he repeated the notion of the honeypot. So you got to break this down rationally. So aides who had clearance, presumably not the aides in his staff, who probably don't have the clearance, convey to the staff at least of Burchett, hey, this guy is not believable. You can't really go to town and bank on this guy. So what is Burchett's response? Why should we believe them? What are they, my aides, who are conveying what the House, it's possible that some of the House intelligence aides conveyed it up the ladder to Comer, or the chair of the Intelligence Committee, or directly conveyed it to Burchett. But Burchett refers to aides telling him you can't believe him. And then he goes, why should we believe them? What do they know? And then he concocts the honeypot theory and throws out either military contractors or the deep state or Russia. Somehow you got to play it out. It's almost like a Saturday Night Live skit. If you want to put it in practice, they have the seductress coming up to the aide and go, I know you don't believe Grush, but then seducing him, and then you cut to the guy later in bed going, you're right, I was wrong. I'm going to go rush to tell Tim Burchett, oh, that was the greatest sex experience of my life. I'm going to tell Tim Burchett that I was wrong. He's absolutely credible. You got to have the hearings. I mean, that's how, to me, this statement about the honeypots is as crazy as anything Marjorie Taylor Greene has said. This rates with Jewish space lasers, or even though she didn't use the exact term, but that was the concept, or Lauren Boebert, or any of the wildest stuff coming from the most unhinged people. And it turns out Burchett is kind of a fellow traveler with the right-wing extremists. And obviously his own belief, he's so gullible. And of course, his bottom line evidence to help make the case is UFOs are in the Bible, So, if you, a fictional movie about a UFO believer in Congress, and you wrote him up as a guy from the South who's a hardcore believer, right, with a Southern accent, and you put it in at a screenwriters meeting, they go, that's a little over the top. It's too extreme. And it's kind of bigoted against Christians and Southerners. So you got to pull that back. It's too much of a caricature and stereotype, and yet he's given a total pass by all mainstream outlets. I mean, I just see Stephen Cambion seized on it. I seized on it. Maybe Greenstreet is, but it's so nutty. He's not treated by mainstream media with, I think, the disrespect he deserves. That's sort of my own take.
Yep. I was gonna also expand on the problematic legislation that's being proposed.
Yes, please do. You know a lot about this and you've read her work. So give the name of her book, her full title, and explain what's in the legislation.
So Jensine Anderson, she's written 2 books recently, Hyperconflation and Hyperconvergence, Religion, Politics, and UFOs. She's actually a believer in the ET hypothesis for some UFOs, but I think she gives like an overall very reasonable and nuanced take on many things, including the legislation. Yeah. She talks about how, for one thing, there's this group of senators called the Gang of 8. So they're meant to have I
think it's the House and Senate.
Yes, yes.
Intelligence. It's highly classified Gang of 8 intelligence cleared politicians. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, and they basically providing oversight for these highly secretive projects, the special access programs. Now, in the proposed legislation, and she actually, I think she counts up like over 100 people would be privy to these SAPs, which is completely insane because there's no way to do proper ensuring that that's going to stay secret, because at least one of these people is going to spill the beans for whatever selfish reason, or they're going to be blackmailed by Russia or whatever. And so that's one of the problems there, is that it creates an unnecessary counterintelligence problem. And there's also the issue of, or just basically the initial impetus for this legislation comes from the New York Times article from 2017, which is like repeatedly cited by Burchett and others in the Grush hearing. That article is completely error-ridden.
Right.
It's got a lot of problems in it. That was the one by Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper, I think.
Cooper, yeah.
So like the initial impetus for this push is itself basically fictitious, because in that New York Times article, it talked about, well, it misrepresented the scope of ORSAP, for one thing. Sure. It talked about these Navy sightings, which they didn't turn out to be extraterrestrial. It was completely mundane stuff.
Right.
So like really the impetus for this whole thing is not, it's like scientific ignorance and something else. It has to be political or some craziness in the culture. But the problem is that this legislation is sort of creating counterintelligence issues. It's making American secret programs potentially vulnerable to disclosure to the Chinese and the Russians.
Right.
Right? Because if you have that many Congress people knowing about these SAPs, the Russians and the Chinese are definitely going to know about them.
What's parallel is Stephen Greenstreet's reporting. Now, the best part of his reporting, I don't know if it was on the record, but he and a colleague reported that because of all the alien UFO chasing, actual foreign flying objects were downplayed. And he at least had what appears to be, and he's a real journalist, at least background quotes from military people talking about the UFO chasing, leading to people ignoring the stuff that later became evident with the Chinese balloons, that Trump ignored for his entire presidency. So there's some parallels there, I think, with her concern. But I want to mention something that you brought up, if I remember correctly, and I think you were helped articulate the notion. You were explaining, and I think this is in part to try to explain why Grush could truly, genuinely believe it. There's me paraphrasing you, so you should correct me. You said there are lots of people who work on extremely compartmentalized SAP programs that involve foreign and unusual and unknown technologies. And if they themselves have a belief in alien stuff, that can contaminate their insight. They can still do exactly the same job, but they can talk out of school about what they think they're working on. And you make the case that some of those kinds of people probably were some of the people who spoke to Grush because they shared the belief system. And I find that among the most plausible explanations for those people who are actually inside the government. But the thing that is so red flag-ish about Grush, outside of Roswell, the only specific thing he ever mentioned to this date, Mussolini UFO crash in the 30s, which is a clearly described pipeline from Brophy, original reporting and fabrication by the Italian researcher. Brophy comes out with new stuff about Aryan aliens and this and that. And then the Italian guy includes it. And then, and I did an interview with Alex Cianetti, who really knows his stuff, he's of Latin American heritage, but he's super close. And he was lecturing about these findings in the early 2000s himself, okay? And then Elizondo and maybe one of the other people from TGSA went over to these conferences. So the source for anyone in America recently for promoting this myth is Elizondo, because he was public about it and undoubtedly briefing him. And how close they were, Grush and Elizondo, we don't know. We have the knowledgeable Bender referring to grooming, but Elizondo has certainly acknowledged knowing Grush. And so the one is the most a hoax. And that's what's so, I don't know, it's so horrifying about how this guy is still allowed to push his narrative. Now, let me ask you this. Is it your view that what is the risks of this new NDAA, the law that passed? What are the risks, in addition, in your view, as well as the scholar's view, and you're free to blend them, of this law in terms of our security secrets, or actually getting to the bottom of what's going on with these anomalous objects?
It would make certain important classified projects potentially open to being known about by the American adversaries.
Right.
And I mean, it even mentions that the US government is not allowed to engage in non-conventional propulsion research, like nuclear propulsion, unless it's known about to all these Congress people, which is completely absurd.
That's really important. I mean, yeah, like we can trust. Do you imagine if Tim Burchett learns anything?
Yeah.
That's the point is, when he's the, and Representative, what's her full name? Luna?
Yeah.
Well, whatever, the former Instagram model and Trump promoter. She trusts them. I think if they learned that there was some propulsion thing, they would lead to the conclusion that this is reverse engineered. And I think there's no way they could be trusted in keeping a secret if keeping the secret undercuts the narrative they want to promote. I mean, This guy sells UFO gear on his congressional webpage. I mean, I think that's a great danger that's being pointed out. You had mentioned to me And what is your perspective on this White House interagency group, or whether it's a working group? And point out give me your perspective on it, because I'm a little unclear, and I think your listeners would be unclear. What is the White House group as you understand it, and how they might get involved in the UAP issue?
Yeah, so this is just again from Jensen's work, but that there could be a split between the White House and the intelligence community on the issue of UAP, because the Biden administration has signed off on some of this UAP legislation, which she thinks it implies tacit support, but I don't know, maybe Biden just wants to kind of get them off his back or something. But that it kind of creates redundancies because there's already arrows, so why do you need this other agency?
Right.
So that's basically the issue there, that there could be a kind of division going on between these branches of government on this particular issue.
And I think what happened in the wake of the balloon shoot downs, or although some of the objects are still not officially identified, so that's further fuel for conspiracy thinkers. There was the announcement of, and I think this is the same thing, of a White House interagency group to look into objects in the skies. I do think my sense of reading the original news accounts were that it was primarily over things, items in the air, not necessarily as driven to anomaly driven as NASA or Arrow. It was more about what's all the space junk. The New York Times Magazine just this past Sunday or the Sunday before had a cover story on space, and one of the lead articles about all the space junk. So there's, like legacy satellites, and then you have Starlink, and then you have actual space junk. And I think because of the sensors and not knowing what stuff is, I think that is the orientation of it. But you had mentioned me earlier prior to this discussion, that there's the risk that that group could be politically influenced and end up pushing more of an alien narrative reflective of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, there's I don't know if this is actually the same thing. Let me just look at it. It's called the IRB. I don't know if that's been set up yet. It could be the same as the interagency group, but
what does IRB stand for?
IRB stands for, let me see, Independent Review Board.
I think the Independent Review Board is the Schumer legislation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, in other words, so the Independent Review Board is the one, and I think there's people who are skeptical, don't like the notion of it. Basically Schumer said, as a legacy to the great Harry Reid, wonderful pioneer, whose noble work should be followed, as opposed to a guy who gave $22 million to his pal to chase ghosts on Skinwalker, primarily. That panel is the one that's supposed to be modeled after JFK declassification. Yeah. I think that is the one under the new Schumer bill that came out after the NDAA, and I'm not sure if that is passed. In other words, that was introduced after Grush came forward, but before he was totally discredited. But I don't know if it's passed, that particular bill. And even some skeptics, both, I think, as I understand it, both some skeptics who don't, and some true believers don't like this board because they view the JFK, decades of, slow walking release of the JFK papers as not a great model, that it won't, even though it's in the writing, the letter of the law says, if there's no good reason to be classified, it should be released, but that's viewed as this big, huge loophole that allows anybody with any authority to hold back important information. So I think they're two separate things, but they're definitely related, because this one is more directly, the IRB is more directly related to the UFOs, and the interagency is more space junk. But they could definitely, But the other point of it is every part of American government, as we have seen, if you just turn on the History Channel, has been infected by true believers, zealots who have little in the way of scientific standards. And so, when Travis Taylor came forward as chief scientist of the UAP task force, he went, and then we learned that the guy who actually headed it, I think the guy who headed it is one of the believers that Wolfmen chased him back home to Northern Virginia.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm mixing up my government UFO nut jobs, alleged nut jobs. But the point of it is if this is a common belief held by a majority of Americans that there are genuinely aliens and sightings of UFOs are that's true, the belief system, then every one of these agencies, first of all, if you're studying space junk or you're on the IRB board, you're going to have a predisposition to be interested in UFOs. So do you think like someone who thinks, oh, this is beneath me, I don't care, I'm a real scientist, or I'm a real, or let's say the kind of person who appears on high prestige boards, I can't get involved in clearing UFO documents. So who are the people who are going to get involved? People who already have a predisposition. So it could easily be polluted,
Yeah. And this
And
legislation also calls for kind of solicitations to be made about people to be included in the IRB, which could be individuals who are associated with non-government organizations or advocacy groups.
yep,
Those
yep. Go ahead. You can
or
list
or
them.
even foreign people with connections to foreign governments. That would be catastrophic.
Right. Yes, and it's pretty easy to infiltrate. I
Yeah.
mean, the level of infiltration of foreign governments into American policymaking, like the actual head of the Russian task force, in the U.S. attorney, working for, he basically got a deferred bribe by one of the top Russian oligarchs. I mean, what I'm getting at is, and then later we learn, what I'm saying is we learn later, after the bribery and corruption and compromising, how the people have been compromised. So, but I think the bigger risk is, I don't know the exact term that Gary Nolan used. I'm forgetting it, but it's in my second article. He was basically salivating over the money that could be made from this new search. And it sounds to me what you're pointing out here is quite valuable, is this IRB with its language about, seeking expertise outside, it basically could be, OSAP 2.0, or whatever you want to call it, or Stargate 2.0. In other words, these crazily irresponsible wastes of millions of dollars, and all you need is someone as clever as Lukatsky at the IRB, because one of the key things that Lukatsky got so far is he was a brilliant bureaucrat. So he's a true believer. He's reading the first Hunt for the Skinwalker while in Iraq around a pool. And then I got to go to Skinwalker. And then he sees orbs. And then he reaches out to Bigelow. And then he reaches out to Harry Reid, and they work it up. And then Harry Reid is saying, well, how are we going to get people to study UFOs? Don't, leave it to me.
Yeah.
And that is so anodyne. We're just studying advanced technologies. I mean, it was so brilliantly done, and it was like 3 people, and it becomes a black budget program. So all you need is one James Lukatsky type person, like in a leadership position, who's persuasive and knowledgeable, and double money out the door to Gary Nolan at the Sol Foundation, or hey, or as the wonderful revered Avi Loeb says, quote, extraordinary claims require extraordinary funding. He actually said that. That's the twist on the Carl Sagan dictum of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So from going to, fine, I've got my $2 million, I'm cool with the Galileo project. We're not really angling for government money. We have our network. And now it's like he has his own private spin-off company that aims to create kind of mini drone type satellites or satellite type things that scan the earth for UFOs and create a more popular input into UFOs. And it's clear that this could also be help get government largesse. It's just, so from going to, I interviewed him, and he's a very interesting case example where, the most polite way to put it is, to use a cliche term, he's sort of gone over his skis. He's kind of pushing narratives ahead of the evidence that he's gathered, However, he is a respected scientist, and the premise of the Galileo project is a responsible premise. But I think there's going to be stuff coming out in a few months where people will learn that it isn't quite, the up and up operation. And the early red flag for me about Avi Loeb was those advisors.
Yeah.
Nick Pope, who, I mentioned has some, Kyle Korff, it hasn't yet been confirmed by them, but there's some law enforcement claims against him because of, he has claimed to have been, the head of the British, Ministry of Defense, UFO research program, although there's so much evidence that he hasn't. We had a lengthy correspondence that I urge people to read. He was very responsive, where he explains why he had the positions and challenges his skeptics, but he now has, as I understand it, a pending law enforcement complaint made by Cal Korff. Whether anybody acts on it, I don't know. There may be other complaints, but so we have Korff, we have Elizondo, and the other point is Jacques Vallée, who is now all in on the Trinity hoax. He's not just an advisor, he's part of the inner circle. It's very critical. He is such an influential figure that he's part of the inner circle. It may not be literally in the building with Avi Loeb and getting, a paycheck directly from Harvard, but he's part of the inner circle research team. So you can't have someone who is doubled down on a hoax be part of your research team. He's clear, and he has his unproven interdimensional biases. You can't have a person like that as part of research. To me, this is very extreme, but I always use this to make a logical analogy. It's like you're doing a historical research program about what happened in Europe during the World War II, and leading part of your research team is David Irving, the Holocaust denier from Britain. And he's going to be exploring, the scope of damage to, Jewish community. You can't have someone who's bought in to nonsensical hoaxes and lies be part of your operation. But, hey, Jacques Vallée, the guy supposedly that was the French researcher modeled on Close Encounters, supposedly, I just, that's what's so alarming to me is the people who are promoting the unproven narratives have the best access to mainstream TV and the best access in the future, I predict coming soon, to oodles of government money.
Yep. And by the way, Elizondo, it always mystified me why he was part of the Galileo project, because he's always intimating that he can't talk about things because of his NDA. So
Right.
the Galileo project is supposed to be an above board, public, completely transparent project. And yet they're bringing in this guy who worked in counterintelligence and is inconsistent about his own role in ORSAP and ATIP.
Putting
And
it charitably as
yeah,
opposed to
right.
fabricating his role. But go ahead.
Mm-hmm. And
Legend.
he can't reveal anything by his own admission about alien technology or UFOs, which is classified, is what he says, that he's always being careful to not reveal too much.
Right,
So
right,
what
right.
is he actually how is he actually gonna help Galileo if he can't?
Well, here is what Avi Loeb told me. Okay. I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed Avi Loeb and I asked because I wanted to keep, I didn't want to ask too, I asked very gentle questions. I might have gently alluded to controversy around Elizondo. I don't know if I asked him directly about Nick Pope because I don't know if he was on then at that point. But he said that these both, I think I might have asked him about both, but I didn't ask him really hard questions. I didn't go over why their claims are very improbable about their high government role. He said that they've worked in the government, they had studied UFOs, and he welcomes their expertise. That is his explanation. So let's assume that is accurate. So there's nothing preventing Elizondo, even with supposed his NDAs, from giving insights. But given how he fabricates things left, right, and center, there's just no other polite way to put it. I'll add the word allegedly, and I definitely sought rebuttal and comment from one of his attorneys, Danny Sheehan. So I feel comfortable. One of the things, so here's the point is, so you have Pope, who's essentially fabricated, although he's modified the wording in his interviews, but not on his website. He headed the Britain's UFO research project and studied UFO crashes and crop circles. And no matter what the government says, so that's one. And then we have, about 6 different stories that Elizondo was told about the launch of OSAP when he came on board, his role with ATIP, OSAP, so he has a lot of improbabilities. But the most telling example of his brazenness is, and I highlighted it in the first article that I did, Spaceship of Fools. Might have been in the second article, but it was when John Greenwald got the FOIA about how the Department of Defense reacted to the New York Times article, and that this guy was claiming that he ran the program for much of its years. It was called ATIP. And I know that his immediate supervisor in DIA later had a sex scandal or a harassment scandal and forced him out. But at the time, he was asking legitimate questions like, and he asked him about it directly. And literally on the day that he's putting in the resignation, or around that same week, Elizondo tells his immediate supervisor this: I was working on a super secret program directly reporting to Defense Secretary James Mattis, and you do not have the clearance to know anything about it. Okay. Your supervisor, when you're resigning, he's being asked about the context of his resignation, he comes up with his obviously a total whopper. And then you read the memo, and he just politely notes, he sort of politely, humbly says, I asked above the chain of command, is there any, and they said there's no indication that this actually happened. He doesn't he doesn't go all Sean Kirkpatrick on him and call him a liar. He just politely, in a memo, a dryly written memo, indicates that nobody in the chain of command, presumably people close to Mattis, given that this guy was like acting head of a particular DIA division, nobody says that Elizondo was working on a super secret program directly reporting only to James Mattis. So you got to imagine the cojones. You are resigning. You have just been in the New York Times. You're making these claims that are going to be easily disproven soon, by Keith Clure in The Intercept, and then later reporting by me and Stephen Greenstreet and all that. You then total nerve. Like you or I imagine having the nerve to make up something so improbable. I'm working on a super secret program for James Mattis, and you, my supervisor in DIA, do not have the clearance to know about it, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I mean, it's just remarkable.
Yeah. Yep.
One of the things that's so funny one of the things that's really interesting, and I think eventually there may, I'm not sure of the exact publisher, but you notice the delay in Elizondo's big book coming out. It hasn't come out, and Greenstreet had something how there was a preliminary announcement on a bookstore about how his book Disclosure is going to be coming out. But the publisher could be facing problems because if he's making claims that aren't supported by evidence, they don't want to be in the situation that's happened in the past where people have published memoirs and then they've had been withdrawn or pulped because they were proven to be false. And there's this delay that's going on, and I do think Korf, among others, it may be or is in the process of bringing attention to the publisher about the apparent falsehoods of Elizondo's claims. And why I think all of that kind of stuff is important is I don't think the fever of UFO conspiracy thinking is going to be broken until the leading promoters, hustlers, advocates, somebody pays some kind of financial price in a lawsuit or, criminal liability. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think there's going to be allegations. And even if it does happen, like true believers get around any kind of cult-like leader, they always say, well, it's just the government deep state putting it up. But nobody today, not a soul, not one. It's the only arena in American public life where people can tell lies, falsehoods, hoaxes, unproven claims for 75 years and not only not face any accountability, but make hundreds of thousands and millions. There's no other arena in American life where you can just lie or at least make unproven claims so often, so regularly, and be so well rewarded and never face accountability. It's just striking to me.
So what do you think actually motivates people like Elizondo? Do you think there could be an actual, is it conceivably some sort of weird counterintelligence program to nab spies, or do you think it's just a grift, or is it a role play?
I think I would love to know. My own feeling is it's really hard. This is my speculation. And if you read what you can, like the brazenness of his falsehoods is really striking to me. Yeah. So I really appreciated Stephen Green. To answer the question, I want to just mention completely brazen falsehoods. Okay. So McGowan, and much of it is well documented, in his series, Jeremy McGowan is a well-cleared Defense Department contractor with a strong interest in tracking UFOs, and he participated in some of the Unidentified show, and he was going to be working on a documentary with with Elizondo, then had a falling out, and before he even wrote his articles in Medium, he was a subject to a lot of harassment and stuff. But the kind of lies, they may seem minor in retrospect, but an easily reported lie, and I think he has it in those articles. If he has it in bold, that means he's got the text evidence, he's got the audio, or he's got the Zoom footage. He put those in bold. Anything else is his knowledgeable contemporaneous paraphrase in regular print. I think it's in bold because it was a Zoom talk with the HBO producers, and they've been traveling around in his Osiris, it's called, bus with special cameras to do tracking of UFOs. And he begins lying through his teeth to the HBO producers about how it's so cutting edge, and how all the great stuff they're getting. And at that moment, the camera at that point now is working, but then was not even working. And he McGowan is sitting there like slack-jawed while Elizondo is spinning and puffing. So my guess is that I think it's fascinating. I think the Who is Lou, documentary by Manny, while there's some needless personal digs in him, I do think it shows the guy has a penchant for exaggeration. So I think he likes attention. He is a good storyteller. And, he did have a real interest in UFOs, and I think has a genuine interest in it and a genuine belief, but then ran it into the ground by making these wildly exaggerated claims, that has been a gold mine for him, and I wonder, that's the whole point. It's kind of like Trump from the time he was hyping his real estate in the 70s and all through now. He never got caught. He never got challenged. So I can't imagine myself sitting around huddling with Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal and going, that program was called ATIP and 22 million. I took it over for someone else, but yeah, I had, and just talking about a $22 million program that he never headed, and talking on the record to the New York Times. I mean, the brazenness of it is just mind-boggling to me. Mind-boggling. And that's why I think we're in where I think he has a huge ego, and he has a lot of really very stellar charismatic qualities. He's a good speaker. He tells good stories, and he looks good with the tattoos and the goatee and the muscle shirts and all that. He looks good. He tells a part, and he's a compelling storyteller. And why not believe him? But what's going on in his head? My understanding, this requires like reading the studies of con men, like reading books about con men. Or I do think that if you tell a story long enough, you really believe it. In other words, whatever little hints of conscience or can I really get away with this shit is swamped. The story is so good. It's so compelling, and you're getting praised and honored. You're being honored by GQ Britain as the man of the year, the hero of the year. You're treated as this god of truth and whistleblowing. So if you're telling this story, I think at this point he probably believes it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so that's my thing: is true belief mixed with ego, greed, and a kind of certain lack of ethics when it comes to telling the truth. And so, of course, I love 5 points at the top. I will always tell you the truth. I mean, the only, I don't know, it's true. Yeah, I think it was George. Who is it? I will never tell. George, the George Washington story, which was actually fabricated, was he wanted to be honest. The myth of George Washington is he vowed to never tell a lie, but then he chopped down the cherry tree and he told his parents and he admitted it or something like that. But the point of it is, it's generally a truism. The phrase, "I will never lie to you," is one of the great in the history of lies and con artistry.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, given the history of Richard Doty in particular, and things discussed in Adam Gorightly's book and Mirage Men, about ops and disinformation being spread into the UFO community, it is very possible that it's in a counterintelligence op. What is your own view? I mean, you're a pretty nuanced thinker on this stuff. So tell me your take. What do you think is the most likely explanation, and what do you think his motivation is?
I think that it's basically just people telling each other stories, and then they hear it from somebody else that they don't know, and they assume that that's an independent source. And so like it seems to them like it represents a truth, but it's just that the other person heard it. Maybe like within an IC context where there's compartmentalized information.
Right.
People can't.
And that is a view you think applies to Elizondo?
Well, I think with Elizondo, it's probably possibly yes, but I also think that some of these people, they just become addicted to the intrigue of their jobs, and then when they retire, when they're pushed out, they can't deal with everyday life, and maybe they just want some of that back. They find it in UFOs and paranormal stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. The UFO community is so welcoming if you tell them the stories they want to hear. And that's why, it's maddening to someone like Stephen Cambion, who has had 5 or 6 shows about Ross Coulthard, from his documentary to the magical path in Area 51, and then he drilled into it with the help of some great people on Metabunk. That story, by the way, it's a simple story about a guy claimed. I mean, if you drill it, a guy claimed that his now departed uncle worked on reverse engineering, and his proof of it was a patch, an image of a patch that his uncle showed him or something like that from Area 51. And then actual people who worked on Area 51 in radar programs said, well, actually, no, this was a specific program that it worked on. And yet this guy was used by Coulthard to elaborate on his show about the vast extent of the evil government cover-up, that they're not listening and telling and paying attention to this guy with this incredibly valid and verifiable story. I mean, so Coulthard, I have emphasized this in my reporting, picked up a lot from Cambion's research, but Coulthard absolutely was a prize-winning reporter, but then he got caught in making exaggerated claims. He then, for whatever reasons that are not clarified, he then left his high prestige job, in the Australian 60 Minutes, after it was shown that one of his exposés was very thinly sourced and weakly sourced, and about, a vast pedophilia ring in the UK Parliament. So, when you get, so he jumped from pedophilia in the UK that led to a $2 million Scotland Yard investigation that ended up actually never going after the people he was accusing, but one of the witnesses ended up getting arrested for actually being trafficking in child porn, supposedly. But he then, he then gets into the UFO field, and because he is a journalist and he knows the form of journalism, he then constructs a book, and then, his path is clear. And just yesterday or today, he's gone from just being a freelancer. He is now elevated, presumably with even more money, to a special correspondent for News Nation. And it was a very good guy who really follows media and conspiracy theories is Will Sommer, went from Daily Beast to the Washington Post. And Sommer did a big article about just how lucrative, and, you know, he didn't break down the dollar figure so much, but just what a boon this UFO story has been, particularly for News Nation. And News Nation was a third tier cable station with some people who used to be stars, but whose stars faded or became controversial. You know, Chris Cuomo was. I have no idea what Elizabeth Vargas is doing there, because whatever her name is, I'm maybe getting it wrong. I don't think she has a scandal, but that's where she ended up. So this is a third tier network, but when they got on the UFO stuff, man, oh man, the ratings went up. And by the time they aired that hour-long special, you know, the full hour-long thing with Grush, the first big interview that Coulthard had, it was beating CNN special, I think, about LeBron James or something. You're beating CNN. Okay, I know CNN doesn't have such great ratings, but you're a third tier station that nobody's heard of. It's not commonly used, and you're beating CNN. I mean, that's how great this story has been. And this is the thing that I think you have posted and others have posted about I think you posted on your Twitter feed about the sources. Someone put together, either you or someone else put together an amusing video of all of these journalists and influencers referencing their anonymous sources. But I'm in real
that was
journalism.
Simon Fly, I think.
Simon Fly, right. And it was pretty entertaining. And this is the other point is, if the world of journalism and anonymous sources, and I try to point that out in my article and maybe some follow-up interviews, is right now in real journalism, if you have an anonymous source, and I'll tell people the scandals, you have to tell your editor exactly who the person is, okay, and what their possible motivation could be. And then that editor has to look at what the evidence is and then decide if they're trustworthy enough to do that. And so obviously, so the best known example of that is, and it's in, I believe it's the reality of it is, well, actually the real name wasn't revealed in All the President's Men, the movie or the book, but the guy Charles Felt was the FBI source. And if you watch the movie All the President's Men, they clearly had informed Ben Bradley, played by Jason Robards, who their source was, who was Deep Throat, and who their other sources were. And they actually show in that movie a mistake being made because of the way they asked the question of their source, and they mistakenly reported what a grand jury had reported. But what's happened since, there were two huge scandals that rocked journalism, I think, from the 80s onward, okay? And they are, just Google it, Charles Glass at the New Republic, and they made a movie about it called Breaking Glass, and this really talented young African-American feature writer and freelancer named Janet Cook. And she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for, and there's a lot of parallels to UFO hustlers here. Janet Cook is awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her brilliantly written feature story about the 10-year-old inner city heroin addict. So when she got her job at the Post, she talked about being a graduate of, I think, Bryn Mawr. So in writing her up, the Post reporters, or maybe it's the Columbia University journalism school where I also attended, called up and said, "Aren't you proud of your alumnus graduate Janet Cook having won the Pulitzer?" What do you think about it? And they go, she never graduated. What are you talking about? She never went to our school, or she never graduated. And then it turns out over the course of the day, all the story. So one, and her editor is Bob Woodward. That's Bob Woodward, who uses anonymous sources very responsibly. Okay. Sometimes people, I've written parodies of Woodward in which you can figure out who his sources are by who looks wonderfully noble in his books. I did, in fact, an entire parody of that called "The Final Days of the Third Reich" is told to Woodward and Bernstein, where they take the word of Himmler and Goering about how they had heard rumors that Hitler was anti-Semitic. I'm veering off point, but the issue on Woodward is this is a man whose career has been built on mixing on the record and off the record sources. He was the editor, and then Bob Woodward, who broke Watergate, begins grilling his reporter, Janet Cook, and then begins demanding the evidence. And by the end of the day or the next day, it's all a sham. There were real young addicts, but there was no 10-year-old addict. And by the end of the day or the next day, her Pulitzer is withdrawn and she is in disgrace for the rest of her life. Now, she may end up, this is the point, is she was a really talented feature writer who didn't need to fabricate. That's all. She was really good writer, really good writer. So she ended up fabricating. Now, what has happened in the wake of Charles Glass making up stuff about hacker conferences he went to that he never went to? And then like 20 of his stories were based on fabricated sources. He's totally discredited. Every journalist, every mainstream journalist, any investigative reporter from then on, for the last 35 years, has had to produce the name of the source and provide the documentation about why they're believing it. It's my claim, if Ross Coulthard worked New York Times or the Washington Post and made exactly the same claims, or somebody like Matt Ford on what's his show, the Good Protest Show or something like that. All these people, and including Leslie Kean, which I'll get to in a moment, all of them would have it thrown in their faces. We can't run with it. And what happened recently is, if you remember when the debrief article came out, Blumenthal and Kean were all saying, oh, they didn't pass on it. We just had to rush it into print because there were threats pending against Grush. And then later, in the last month or two, last few months in the interview, she kind of admitted, and you got to see the interview itself. It was an obscure podcast, relatively obscure podcast, where she admits that both the Post and Times felt they didn't have the evidence. And when she says the word evidence, she either literally or figuratively uses air quotes, like, they said we didn't have enough evidence. Like it's clear in her tone that the notion of evidence isn't that important. And then there is this camera interview in a well-known documentary. Now, I may be unfairly characterizing, but my takeaway was, look, we had some people who vouched her. She was leaning on the fact that people vouched for Grush, in her reporting. And then she quotes people, some on the record, some on back. And then, she made up the name of a person in one of these intelligence agencies who also confirmed the existence of the project and the veracity of these projects and the veracity of Grush. And it turns out there is nobody with that name who works there. Now, let's assume it's so secret that he can't use his real name. You at least have to put the name in quotes and indicate who was anonymous because of the nature of his secretive job. No, it's put out there as a real name, as a real person. And that's the whole point. All of these stories are built on anonymous sources. And then, of course, as Stephen Cambion has deliciously skewered, Stephen Greer has had 700 anonymous sources over the decade, hundreds of anonymous sources, all from government, current forming government or military insiders who are telling him all this amazing stuff. And then periodically he brings them forward to the National Press Club. And then when actual journalists or investigative oriented people look at it, it falls apart. So the whole thing is so nutty.
Mm-hmm. And Leslie Kane also, in the 2017 article, she would later admit that she knew about the paranormal aspect, like the skinwalker stuff, but she didn't emphasize that, or she didn't mention it because she wanted to get the UFO.
She gave me directly a quote that I couldn't believe she gave me, and she gave in the movie Phenomena. So my memory of her quote to me is, so I basically said, what about skinwalkers? She said, well, we had to kind of roll it out slowly. I'm paraphrasing. It's in the article. We had to, the public wasn't really ready for that. Well, you're a journalist. You're not supposed to function as a propagandist. But she knew that if she had any reference at all to Lukotsky chasing after floating tubular bells or running after wolfmen or ghosts, it would have been laughed out of the newsroom. And in Stephen Greenstreet's excellent video on that, he said he does this thing, where you correct a headline, and he corrected the original Times headline to go $22 million wasted on chasing ghosts on Utah ranch, as the headline underneath, the glowing orbs and phenomena. And then she also told James Fox, or one of his producers, about why, in terms of actual encounters with living aliens, and seeing aliens or alien bodies, why she didn't mention it as part that she learned about that was part of this government research. She said she actually says, I was trying to enhance the credibility of the UFOs. That's not your job as a journalist. You can have that as a goal. I mean, I, as a journalist, I do advocacy journalism. So I have a hypothesis. Let's say that, in my mental health books, that there's too much off-label overprescribing in a dangerous way of antipsychotics for people who aren't psychotic or don't qualify for it. And it could be dangerous and lead to heart attacks and deaths and so on. So I have a hypothesis, but if I encounter, my book is balanced because I obviously tell stories of people whose lives have been transformed, who had schizophrenia, who benefited from antipsychotic. So it's the notion that you go where the evidence leads you. You have your hypothesis, and then you should be willing to modify it or manage it. Not her. If she doesn't have, that's the whole thing. It's like any propagandist. It's what Stephen Camping calls the lie by omission. So if you know that they were chasing werewolves at home that were running back to haunt them in Virginia, and people are getting ill from the werewolves and alien hitchhikers coming from Skinwalker, or all of that stuff, that if she knew all that and certainly had the ability to know it, and she doesn't report any of it, it's clear she has an agenda. And that is not what should be done if you're a journalist. Even if you're a freelance journalist, you've got to be able to give. You have to present in the space a lot of the full story, and she's never done that. And then when she's challenged, like the eye against the lens in Peru or something, that she claimed was the best single case ever, the one that will make the skeptics bow down and admit they were wrong, and she couldn't get experts to agree, with her claim that, that it was a UFO as opposed to a fly against the lens, I mean, if you have that in your history, it's just so questionable. And then of course, who was she had been romantically involved with one of the top
Bud Hopkins.
Bud Hopkins. So she
Yeah.
comes out of the world of Bud Hopkins and his completely irresponsible hypnotic regression to prove alien abductions. And so that's the world she comes at it. And she was an actual, this is the thing that's shocking to me. I mean, particularly in the New York Times, she was an actual lobbyist or functioned as a lobbyist for a UFO transparency organization. And she helped arrange a lawsuit against NASA for hiding the truth about the Kecksburg crash in Pennsylvania, which has later been shown most likely to have fallen from some satellite or whatever. But that's not how she prevailed. But the point is, if you're lobbying for transparency of UFOs on the premise that the government is covering up, you shouldn't be covering a story about a secret UFO program in the government. You know, because to me, it'd be like you work for a pro-life organization and you were completely opposed to Roe versus Wade, and suddenly the Dobbs decision comes out and you're assigned to write a news story about it, you know, and you have a clear view that this is wonderful, the Dobbs decision, and it reflects your views and you're Catholic. Well, of course not. You wouldn't be permitted to do it. But she had a pre-existing bias that has been evident throughout her career. And yet there she is writing the New York Times story and using the wrong name, taking Elizondo, you know, and if you listen to those interviews that Blumenthal and her gave, they talk about how tough it is to get it into the Times, how much it was vetted. So there couldn't have been any real vetting of Elizondo except info that he gave them, like his resume, you know. And they had a real DOD reporter, Helene Cooper, who could have figured out, some of them could have figured out, hey, it wasn't even called ATIP, it was called OSAP. They could have figured out some of this stuff, and yet there it goes. So they so fell down on the job, it's just unbelievable. But to me, I thought there might have been some improvement when they had a real Defense Department reporter do a preview of an upcoming UAP report and had references to space junk and kind of a skeptical tone. I said, oh, good, they have a real defense reporter. Then now we're going to get real coverage. Then that changed completely with this total clickbait article. Did aliens land, you know, in New Mexico in 1945? The Pentagon wants to know. And it just literally gives one side, Jacques Vallée, recounting the Trinity story. There's not even the Trinity skeptic, or you know, there was remotest reference to the view that at the time that article appeared, this is before D. Dean Johnson's piece, but there had been voluminous coverage in the skeptical media and bloggers like Jason Colavito and Robert Schaefer and others poking holes in the absurdity of these claims. Okay, that was just so there wasn't the definitive proof that it was a hoax when that New York Times article ran, but it was clearly a subject of doubt. And she, you know, it's almost as if, you know, when you do a Google search and you don't want a term to come up, it's like she typed in Trinity, New Mexico, you know, Padilla or one of the names, and put a dash negative. Don't pull up the word skeptic. I mean, it's like it's willful blindness, because it's willful blindness at that point if you're dealing with a widely disbelieved tale, you know, at that point, prior to being exposed as a hoax, and there's not even a hint. The only little fig leaf she has if she was called to the carpet on this, which is never going to happen, is, well, I said he or something. But there's no hint that this was already widely disparaged. It's crazy. And that was my reaction that this. So by the time my article came out, it had already been totally destroyed by D. Dean Johnson as a hoax from top to bottom on every element of it, completely. And then you had Jeff Knox adding to it with his brilliant research on Brophy's lies feeding into the evolving made-up story. So by the time my article came out, my article came out in July, okay? So when my article comes out in July, there's already plenty of good showing it's total nonsense. And this, in any other field of endeavor, any other topic, there would have been an apology or a correction. But, D. Dean Johnson and Washington Spectator and Jason Colavito are not, and Jeff Knox, well, we're not the Washington Post or something. We're not, we don't have the visibility of other organizations. But one of my suggestions for this movement of people who want science and care about skepticism, at least having a reasonable skepticism, is they ought to, one vehicle might be working up an open letter to the New York Times on some of their falsehoods and demanding retraction and getting some top scientists and scholars and journalists to sign on and then send it. There's no ombudsman anymore, by the way. They used to have an ombudsman at the Times who would take, there is no such ombudsman anymore, but you can still raise public pressure by having a letter to the Times signed by lots of people or an open letter that's publicized, pointing out these obvious flaws and lies and demanding corrections or retractions. That would be a good, narrow focused vehicle that could, I think, bring in skeptical. The other is somebody has to be sued in a meaningful way or face criminal penalties for make. And the question then is, if someone is lying totally about a fabricated incident and fabricating their credentials in the government at a UFO conference that people pay money for, is that a grounds for some kind of consumer fraud lawsuit? Or complaint? That's what Korf has argued. On the other hand, there's First Amendment rights. So it's not been settled. If you're at a UFO conference, defense is, well, UFOs are an unsettled issue. There's a lot of fables. So what? So we don't know. But at this point, this field is, there's gold in them there UFO hills. It's such a wide open area where you could say and do anything. Like tomorrow, if I was a guy about to retire and I had a minor position in the military, I would look at Grush and Elizondo. And if I studied UFO lore, I could cook something up and I could Elizondo and Grush and come up with something that's a little, I would go to Arrow and I would go to the Senate committees with what I think is evidence that isn't classified and then go public. And then, it's just maybe a fuzzy photo or whoever is. So, like people, it's a wide open world now for UFOs and to make money. And unfortunately, there's no pushback outside of podcasts that you're doing and some of the great skeptical journalism that's been emerging in the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Last 6 years. Actually.
By the way, you reminded me that Leslie Kean is actually, I believe, a member of Bigelow's Institute for Consciousness Studies.
Right. And yes, that's the one about near death. She left, but what happened when they had the hearings were the first set of UFO hearings of any kind was that, I'm trying to remember, was that in 2022 or 2023? But it was in May. It was in May. It was in May. Maybe it was May of 2023. It could have been, but in any case, what happened is she and Blumenthal did a puff piece in advance of the first, it was going to be the first UFO hearings in 50 years. So she resigned from her board position and as a judge of the consciousness studies thing and resigned and then did the freelance piece. But one of the things is one of their first award was a $50,000 award to a guy who claims that his son had, and he's written a New York Times bestseller about his son's near-death experience, proving an afterlife. And his son used to be an airline jet fighter in World War II or something. I forget what the claim was, what his son's life was. But one of the claims that the father made is there was absolutely nothing in his son's TV or film or social media that would in any way influence his claims. And then it was later shown he was like surrounded by World War II memorabilia. It may have been another war, but the notion was that this was a pretty easily debunked case. I'm a person, frankly, who is open-minded on the possibility of life after death and of a supreme being. However, I'm not forming a nonprofit asking the government to give me $22 million to prove the afterlife or that there's a supreme being. That's the difference. There's nothing wrong with religious belief, except, of course, when it turns into fanaticism and, zealotry, as we're seeing, in Israel and Palestine now. I think faith is very legitimate and can be very enriching in people's lives. But that's why we have in the US separation of church and state, in theory. So if there's a quasi-religious belief in UFOs, it shouldn't be funded and fueled. Anyway, that's with government money.
Mm-hmm. I think I've asked you all the questions I've got here. Do you want to give a sort of wrap-up statement or anything else that I missed?
Yeah, well, my wrap-up statement is that I do think the skeptic community isn't going to be making a difference. There's really good research. The skeptic community is not going to be making a difference until, it's my view that people like Penn and Teller, who are very rich and run the skeptic shows, or the Center for Science and the Paranormal Research Group that's skeptical, until the groups and people with reasonably good pockets get involved in looking for really a good lawyer with good grounds for trying out a consumer fraud lawsuit against some of the hucksters or stockholder lawsuits. Now, some of this court may be trying some of this like stockholder lawsuits against the whatever mega company owns the History Channel and so on, whatever. Until there's legal consequences, it's probably going to be easier to prove in the civil liability than criminal liability against these people making all these false claims or unproven claims. It's not going. It's just going to continue for another 75 years. I can see this going on for another century. I don't see anything in the UFO community that would get any of them to step back, except a few individuals going, well, Jesus, we haven't seen any proof yet. And we've been promised disclosure. But that's where there's excellent work in previous apocalyptic groups, including a book or a paper called When Faith Fails, where so the skeptic community can do all the reporting it wants, it's not going to really change the worldview of the skeptics. And the better way in is for high profile, well organized targeting in open letters, media, and complaints to media outlets that are promoting completely unproven nonsense or outright falsehoods. And, first just complaints, so it at least gets some possibly mainstream media attention. So right now, fortunately, Mick West, for instance, identified the reality behind the best explanations of the Navy videos by early 2018. He wasn't even quoted in the Times until years later. And then eventually people began quoting him. But his work was so commonsensical, had so much common sense and had seeming such veracity. And then ultimately, NASA and the Pentagon, to varying degrees, confirmed his analysis years later. And mainstream media at this point feels they don't have to pay any attention to skeptics. It's not part of, and normal reporting, you try to get different sides. At this point, the skeptic community is not often encountered. However, in the coverage of Avi Loeb, it was, because they did have astronomers who were skeptical. So the skeptical community has got to get its act together and look for ways to pressure the media and appeal to those with some deep pockets or good connections to get into civil court. And that might be a way to help break the fever.
All right. Well, I hope we can continue this conversation at some later point.
Sure, and I recommend very highly people read your blog. UFO is, give it the full title again.
Ufologyiscorrupt.com.
It's very on point. So thank you very much. It's great talking to you, and hopefully your audience will enjoy this.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thanks.